Barron Trump stepped into the crowded airport, his small bag slung over his shoulder, the noise of the terminal bustling around him. He'd just wrapped up a long day of meetings and was eager for the quiet comfort of his first-class seat on the plane. It was a routine he'd followed many times before. Check in, find his seat, relax for the flight ahead. But just as Barron was about to settle into his plush first-class seat, something caught his eye. An elderly woman, hunched over, was struggling to carry a large bag as she walked toward the back of the plane. Her face showed the exhaustion of a long day, and she seemed overwhelmed by the weight of the world, her steps slow and uncertain. Barron paused, watching her for a moment, the usual calm expression on his face now replaced with concern. It wasn't like him to be moved so deeply by a stranger, yet something in her struggle tugged at his heart. He glanced at the luxury of his own seat, the comfort that was rightfully his after a taxing day, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the need for kindness, for a moment of comfort that this woman clearly needed. In an instant, Barron stood up, a decision made in his mind without hesitation. He walked toward the gate agent, his voice soft but firm. "Could I give my seat to that lady?" he asked, his gesture completely unanticipated. "She looks like she could use the comfort. What happens next will change both of their lives in ways they never expected." The plane was already in motion, and the cabin hummed with the quiet rhythm of the flight taking off. Barron walked down the aisle with a calmness that was almost serene, his first-class ticket tucked neatly in his hand. As he passed by rows of cramped seats, he couldn't help but notice the woman. She was sitting in one of the narrow economy seats, her shoulders slumped with fatigue. The tiredness in her face spoke volumes. This wasn't just a long flight for her. It was the culmination of days, perhaps weeks, of struggles. She had already settled in, but her discomfort was palpable. The contrast between her situation and the luxury of first class was stark. Barron paused for a moment, just observing her. He could see the weariness in her eyes, the small sigh she gave as she shifted, trying to make herself more comfortable in the cramped space. The people around her were lost in their own worlds, plugged into their devices or buried in books. No one was paying attention to the quiet desperation of this woman, struggling to find a moment of rest in her seat. For a brief second, Barron hesitated. He had a first-class ticket, the comfort and space it offered, after a long day of work, something he truly needed. Yet there was something inside him that stirred, something that urged him to act. Without overthinking, he turned around and walked back down the aisle. When Barron reached the woman's row, she was caught off guard. She looked up, startled, as if she hadn't noticed him approaching. He smiled softly, his expression kind but sincere. "Excuse me, ma'am," Barron began, his voice calm but carrying a weight of compassion. "I was wondering if you would like to take my seat in first class. It's much more comfortable up there, and I think you deserve it." The woman blinked, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just staring at him in shock. Her hand tightened around her bag as if unsure whether she had heard him correctly. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft and cautious. Barron repeated his offer, his words gentle but firm. "I've got a seat in first class, and I think you've earned the comfort. You've had a long journey ahead of you, and I just want to offer you the opportunity to relax for the rest of the flight." Her mouth opened and closed, unsure how to respond, her mind racing. She had been flying for hours, battling through delays and cramped spaces. Why would someone like Barron Trump, a young man with so much, offer his seat to her, a complete stranger? She was overwhelmed with confusion and gratitude, her heart beginning to race with a mix of disbelief and wonder. Could this really be happening? Was this a dream? After a long moment of silence, she found her voice, still unsure, but filled with warmth. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. Barron nodded, his face softening into a reassuring smile. "Absolutely. You deserve to be comfortable." The woman blinked, trying to hold back the tears that were now welling up in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. No one had ever shown her such kindness from a stranger, let alone someone of Barron's stature. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not just as another face in a crowded airplane, but as a person deserving of dignity. With a deep breath, she stood up, her hands shaking just slightly as she gathered her things. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, all eyes on the exchange, quietly witnessing this moment of kindness. The woman walked past Barron toward the first-class section, her steps hesitant but hopeful. The small act of generosity had changed everything. She wasn't just moving to a different seat, she was walking into a moment of grace, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, could make the world feel a little lighter. As the woman made her way up the aisle, Barron returned to his seat, the ripple of his actions echoing in the silent admiration of those around him. As the elderly woman settled into Barron's first-class seat, she exhaled deeply, her tired body sinking into the plush chair. The space around her was vast compared to the cramped quarters of economy. The luxury of the first-class cabin was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She adjusted herself, trying to wrap her mind around the fact that someone like Barron, had just given her this gift, his seat, his comfort. The feeling was surreal. The soft hum of the plane was accompanied by the faint whispers of passengers around her, their eyes now fixed on the elderly woman. She could feel their stares, the curiosity, the surprise. They had all witnessed what had just unfolded, and now, a wave of quiet shock rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, some even raising an eyebrow, not fully understanding what had just happened. This wasn't something they saw every day. A young man, so privileged, so accustomed to comfort, had just selflessly given up his seat to someone who was a complete stranger. To the other passengers, it was an act of kindness that stood out like a beacon in a world often consumed by self-interest. They hadn't expected to witness something so simple, yet so profound. Barron hadn't asked for recognition, hadn't sought applause, but in that moment, he had changed everything for the elderly woman, and perhaps for all who had witnessed it. As she settled into the luxury of the seat, the woman turned slightly, her eyes searching for Barron. When she found him, she didn't know what to say. How could words express the gratitude she felt? She had lived a lifetime of working hard, never expecting anything to come easy, let alone something as unexpected as this. She met Barron's eyes, and for the first time she saw him not just as the son of a famous figure, but as a person, a young man who had seen her struggle and chosen to act with kindness. Barron returned to his seat, a quiet but genuine smile on his face. He gave her a small nod as if to say, "It's just the right thing to do." His words, simple yet full of sincerity, hung in the air, offering a silent connection between them. In that brief exchange, something intangible passed between them, a recognition of humanity, of shared dignity. It wasn't about the seat, or the luxury, or even the grand gesture. It was about respect, about recognizing another person's worth, regardless of their background or circumstances. For the elderly woman, this moment felt like a quiet miracle, a gift not just of comfort, but of compassion. She felt her heart soften, and with it, the weight of years of hardship seemed to lift, if only for a moment. It was a reminder that kindness, when given freely, could touch lives in ways we might never fully understand. As the plane ascended into the sky, the hum of the engine seemed to blend into the gentle murmur of the passengers around Barron. The initial surprise of the seat exchange slowly began to settle, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't just the change of location that had made the flight feel different. It was the quiet power of Barron's act of kindness that lingered in the air. Conversations that had once been confined to private screens or quiet bookshelves now blossomed between strangers. People, once preoccupied with their own thoughts, began exchanging glances and soft words. A businessman seated just a few rows behind Barron leaned over the armrest, catching his attention with a simple nod. "That was a beautiful thing you did," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You don't see that much these days." Barron smiled politely, not seeking praise but appreciating the quiet acknowledgement. It felt good to know that his gesture had left an imprint on someone else. The woman, still settling into her first-class seat, turned briefly toward Barron. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her, and she smiled in her own way, mouthing a soft, "Thank you." Her eyes met his, and in that brief exchange, something deeper connected them. It wasn't just the seat. It wasn't just the comfort she was receiving. It was the warmth of being recognized, seen, respected. In Barron's eyes, she wasn't just another passenger. She was a person deserving of kindness, a person who mattered. The ripple effect of Barron's small act didn't end there. A young mother seated in the row ahead of him turned around, holding her baby carefully in her arms. She offered Barron a warm smile, mouthing, "Thank you for doing that. It's a rare thing to see nowadays." Barron nodded back, his heart swelling with the unexpected impact his actions were having on the people around him. The cabin, once filled with the sounds of routine travel, now felt alive with a sense of goodwill. Barron had unknowingly created a moment of connection among a group of strangers. His small gesture of kindness had sparked something much larger than himself, a chain reaction that reminded people of the power of empathy. As he leaned back in his seat, the weight of the moment finally settled on him. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about making people feel valued, seen, and human in a world that often overlooked these simple truths. Barron remained calm, but inside, something had shifted. His act of giving away a first-class seat had rippled outward, touching more lives than he could have imagined. And for the elderly woman, now nestled in comfort, the ripple reached her deeply. In the silence between their shared glance, she understood that Barron's kindness wasn't just about the seat. It was a message. You matter. You are seen. You are worthy of dignity. As the plane touched down at its destination, the cabin was filled with the usual sounds of seatbelts unfastening and carry-on luggage being pulled from overhead compartments. But for the elderly woman sitting in Barron's first-class seat, it was different. She rose slowly, carefully gathering her belongings, her face etched with a mixture of emotion and disbelief. She hadn't expected this moment of kindness, of being seen, to carry so much weight. Barron watched from his seat as she made her way toward the front of the plane, her steps deliberate, almost reverential. He could see the emotion in her eyes, the quiet gratitude that spoke volumes. When she reached the aisle, she paused, her gaze meeting his one last time. Their eyes locked, and in that brief moment, a silent understanding passed between them. There were no words necessary. She nodded to him, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything that had transpired. Barron nodded back, the corners of his mouth lifting into a subtle, quiet smile. It wasn't a smile born of pride or recognition. It was the smile of someone who knew, deep down, that the impact of his small act had done more than just provide comfort for a few hours. It had reminded both of them that kindness, however small, could change everything. It wasn't about the seat, the luxury, or even the act itself. It was about restoring dignity and reminding someone that they mattered. The woman exited the plane, her steps a little lighter, her heart a little fuller. Barron remained seated for a moment, reflecting on the simplicity of it all. What seemed like an ordinary exchange, a seat on a plane, had quietly transformed the energy of the flight, reminding everyone on board of the power of empathy and generosity. As Barron stood to leave, a few passengers approached him. One by one, they offered quiet words of thanks, their voices filled with genuine appreciation. "What you did back there, it's rare to see that kind of kindness anymore," one woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've reminded me that there's still goodness in the world." A man across the aisle shook his hand firmly. "That was incredible," he said. "You made a difference." For Barron, their words weren't about seeking praise. They were a reminder of the impact that simple acts of kindness can have on the world. What had started as a small gesture, a decision made on instinct, had become a ripple that touched the lives of strangers. By the time Barron exited the plane, the story of his quiet generosity had already begun to spread. Word of the young man who gave up his first-class seat had caught the attention of passengers, and soon, the media picked up on it. Headlines quickly followed. Barron Trump's simple act of kindness goes viral. What seemed like an ordinary moment had sparked something far greater. Barron's gesture wasn't just a random act. It had become a symbol, a reminder that kindness didn't need to be grandiose to be impactful. The story resonated with people all over, proving that everyday actions, however small, could change lives in ways we might never fully understand. Back at home, Barron sat quietly in his room, the soft glow of his phone screen illuminating his face. The world had changed since that flight, in ways he hadn't expected. What had started as a small, simple gesture, offering his first-class seat to an elderly woman, had quickly spiraled into something much larger. As Barron scrolled through social media, he found his story everywhere. News outlets had picked up on it. Articles, tweets, and posts from people across the globe shared their admiration for his quiet act of kindness. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition, but somehow, his action had sparked a ripple effect that reached far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. He could feel the weight of the positive energy around him. Messages of hope, inspiration, and gratitude flooded his phone. People were thanking him, saying that his act had reminded them of the power of kindness. Strangers shared their own stories of compassion, speaking about how Barron's gesture had reignited their faith in humanity. The elderly woman had become a symbol, too. Her gratitude had touched hearts, and now Barron's act of generosity was spreading like wildfire. In a world often full of noise and chaos, his simple act had offered a moment of peace, a reminder of what it meant to truly care. Barron's heart swelled as he read the messages. He wasn't used to the attention, but this was different. It wasn't about him. It was about the message that had been carried by his small, quiet gesture, that kindness, empathy, and compassion still existed, even in a world that sometimes felt disconnected. What he'd done had created an undeniable ripple effect. His simple decision to act with compassion in a fleeting moment had sparked a conversation about selflessness, about making the world a little brighter by showing care for one another. Barron smiled softly to himself, reflecting on the deeper lesson. The story wasn't just about giving up a first-class seat. It was about the realization that sometimes the smallest actions have the most profound impact. It wasn't about being recognized. It was about doing what was right when the opportunity arose, no matter how small. Barron had unknowingly become a reminder to the world that every act of kindness, no matter how simple, has the power to change lives. The ripple of his action would continue to spread, reaching more people than he could ever imagine. Barron realized that the simplest gestures speak the loudest, and sometimes those gestures are the ones that carry the greatest weight. It was a lesson that would stay with him forever, a quiet reminder that compassion, no matter how small, is a force that binds us all.